My twin brother appeared at my door covered in bruises. His wife's brothers had been beating him for a year, so we switched places and I made sure they'd never forget it. All right, Reddit. Last year my identical twin brother showed up at my place looking like he'd been dragged through hell. I found out his wife's brothers had been using him as their personal punching bag for over a year. He begged me to trade places with him so he could disappear long enough to recover. I agreed, and spent 7 miserable weeks living in his shoes, gathering evidence. Then I invited those guys over for dinner and watched everything they'd built go up in flames. Here's how it all unfolded. My name's Nathan, 32, male. I work as a civil engineer for a construction firm in Seattle. Normal job, own a condo, drive a dependable truck. My life is pretty unremarkable. My twin brother Ethan and I are identical down to the scar above our left eyebrow from a childhood bike crash. Growing up, we made a sport out of confusing people, switching classes, messing with teachers, pretending to be each other at birthdays. Our parents could tell who was who, but almost no one else could unless they looked closely. We stayed close through college and adulthood, even though our careers branched off. Ethan went into marketing, met his wife Kristen at a company mixer 5 years back. They had one of those fast, intense romances, married within a year. Then came their daughter, Sophie, who just turned 4. I stood next to him as his best man, watching him grin the entire ceremony. He looked genuinely happy. Solid career, beautiful wife, sweet kid, house in the suburbs. Everything seemed picture perfect. So nothing prepared me for what happened that Tuesday night in March. I was at my kitchen table, halfway through marking revisions on commercial building plans, when someone knocked. It wasn't the confident bang of a friend stopping by or the quick tap of a delivery driver. This knock sounded hesitant, almost ashamed, like the person on the other side barely believed they should be there at all. I put my coffee down and walked to the door with this creeping sense of dread tightening in my chest. When I opened it, I didn't recognize him at first. Not because he didn't look like me, we're identical twins, but because everything about him seemed diminished. It was like someone had scooped out the brother I knew and left a hollow outline standing in front of me. His shoulders slumped, his head hung low. When he finally lifted his face, I saw the bruises. Not accidental ones, these were intentional, patterned, deliberate. A deep, purple blot covered his cheekbone, fading at the edges into sickly yellow. His bottom lip was split and crusted with old blood. When he shifted, he winced and cradled his ribs like even breathing hurt. His knuckles were torn up, raw and scraped. But the worst thing was his eyes. Empty, haunted in a way I had never seen, not even during the rough years after Mom died. I stepped aside without thinking, pulling the door open wider. Ethan walked in like someone drifting through a life he didn't belong to anymore. I shut and locked the door behind him before turning to face him. He stood in the middle of the room, hugging himself, staring at the floor. The silence pressed down on us until I finally managed to say his name. He actually flinched when I spoke. That tiny reaction, so unlike the confident, outgoing brother I'd known my whole life, hit me harder than the bruises did. What happened? My voice cracked with anger and fear I couldn't hide. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, like every bone in his body ached. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tight his knuckles went pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin and shredded. "It's Kristen's brothers," he whispered. "Blake and Craig." My stomach dropped. I knew them. Loud, overbearing jerks who dominated every room. Blake, the older one, around 35, worked in construction management. Craig was the younger one, about 30, working some generic sales job. Both of them carried that loud, swaggering confidence you only see in men who've never been told no in their lives. I'd always chalk them up as the kind of people you put up with out of obligation, not affection. But this was something far beyond unpleasant in-laws. For the next 2 hours, Ethan told me everything. The story came out in jagged pieces, his voice trembling, hands unsteady, as he tried to describe what the last year had been like. "It started small," he said, a shove disguised as a joke, a snide comment thrown across the dinner table, all chalked up to harmless guy humor written off as just teasing. They mocked his job in marketing, called him spineless, treated him like he was beneath them. At family gatherings, they'd tear into him while Kristen either laughed along awkwardly or stared at her plate, pretending not to notice. She never once stepped in. Ethan thought he could handle it. He figured if he stayed polite, kept the peace, proved he wasn't a threat, they'd eventually lose interest. That wasn't what happened. Soon they were letting themselves into the house without knocking, raiding the fridge, taking over the TV, making it blatantly clear that Ethan's presence in his own home was optional at best. When Kristen wasn't around, they'd linger, pushing him verbally and physically to see how much they could get away with. Then, 6 months ago, everything escalated. Blake shoved him hard into a wall after Ethan quietly asked them to leave because Sophie was asleep upstairs. Ethan tried to stand firm. He tried to set a boundary. That's when they beat him for the first time. On a Saturday afternoon, they cornered him in the garage, accusing him of embarrassing the family, of disrespecting Kristen, of not knowing his place. Craig held him while Blake punched him. Controlled, measured hits, like he was administering some twisted discipline rather than losing his temper. They warned him to keep his mouth shut. Said no one, not even Kristen, would believe him. Said they'd ruin him if he tried anything. His marriage, his daughter, his reputation, all gone. They'd paint him as the unstable one, the liar, the problem. And because Kristen's parents worshipped Blake and Craig, because the entire family circled the wagons around those two, Ethan knew it wasn't an empty threat. So he stayed quiet. He endured the bruises, the intimidation, the degrading comments. He got used to covering up purple welts under long sleeves, shrugging off facial bruises as clumsiness or work mishaps. Kristen noticed, of course, but she never questioned him. Whether out of denial, fear, or loyalty to her family, she never pressed for the truth. And the worst part? They used Sophie without ever laying a hand on her. They'd make vague, ominous comments about how accidents happen, or how courts always favor the mother, or how easy it would be to twist things so Ethan looked like the dangerous parent. Those remarks kept him frozen in place. He wasn't just scared for himself, he was terrified for his daughter. "I feel scared all the time," he confessed, voice cracking. "I'm scared they'll go further. I'm scared something will happen to Sophie if I push back. I'm scared Kristen will choose them if I force her to pick a side. I feel like I'm suffocating and I don't know how to get out." Then he lifted his head, eyes swollen and pleading, and asked me for help. Not someday. Not eventually, right now. He said he needed to vanish for a bit to recover, breathe, figure out a plan. But he couldn't just walk away. If he disappeared, Blake and Craig would come after him. Or they'd retaliate by scaring, manipulating, or hurting Sophie. He needed someone who could convincingly step into his life. And because we're identical twins, because we'd fooled people since childhood, because no one outside of close family could reliably tell us apart, he believed I could pull it off. He asked me to become him, to take over his routines, live in his house, be around Kristen, and endure whatever those two decided to dish out while he slipped somewhere safe to heal. I should have refused. Anyone with common sense would have. It was reckless, dangerous, practically suicidal, and probably illegal in more ways than one. But I didn't refuse. I looked at my brother, my twin, the person who'd shared my DNA and childhood and every major milestone of my life, and I saw how completely beaten down he was. The bruises, the terror humming under his skin, the exhaustion carved into his expression. I couldn't send him back into that house alone. I couldn't let those men continue destroying him piece by piece, so I said yes. I told him I'd do it, that I would step into his life, walk into the lion's den, and buy him the time he desperately needed. But I also made a silent promise. I wasn't going in just to endure what he had. I was going in to end it. I would gather proof, expose Blake and Craig, and strip them of the control they'd held for far too long. I would make sure they never laid a hand on him again. For the next 3 days, we planned everything with the efficiency of a covert operation. I stayed at Ethan's apartment while we strategized, using my condo as the base for all the equipment and the evidence tracking setup. Ethan walked me through every nuance of his daily routines, from how he laced his shoes to the exact route he took to the office, avoiding certain roads that stressed him out. He showed me videos and photos of his workspace. I memorized the names and faces of his coworkers, David from the next cubicle who talked endlessly about football, Linda in accounting who baked cookies every Friday, and his boss, Jennifer, who was notorious for impossible deadlines. I studied his active marketing campaigns, absorbed the client details, and learned the jargon he used in meetings so I could blend in without tripping any alarms. Evenings were reserved for learning his home life. Ethan played videos of Sophie during dinner, during playtime, before bed. I paid attention to everything. The silly voices he used for different characters in her books, the countdown he used when she stalled bedtime, the way he lifted her up and spun her when she was proud of a drawing. She was in a dinosaur phase, obsessed with velociraptors, constantly sketch-sick. Jungle scenes. Her constant companion was a stuffed triceratops named Mr. Stompy. Kristen required more careful study. Ethan told me how she liked her coffee. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, always in the blue mug her parents gave her. She worked as a billing coordinator downtown, left at 7:30 a.m., returned around 5:15 p.m. She disliked talking about her job and preferred unwinding with trashy reality TV. Lately, she'd fallen into a habit of doom-scrolling on her phone instead of having real conversations. She didn't used to be this distant, Ethan said softly one night. In the beginning, we talked about everything. We planned our future. But when her brothers started showing up more often, she shifted. She chose them, bit by bit, until it felt like she wasn't choosing me at all. According to him, the marriage had been deteriorating for 2 years. Little fractures had accumulated. Kristen brushing off his concerns about her brothers, laughing at their mockery, treating their toxic behavior as harmless fun. She never defended Ethan, never acknowledged how much their constant presence and belittling hurt him. Then Ethan explained, step by step, how Blake and Craig operated. Blake usually dropped by midweek, Wednesday nights, or sometimes Thursday afternoons if he'd taken time off. He'd use the spare key Kristen gave him early in their marriage, letting himself in like he owned the place. Blake would immediately assert control, raiding the fridge, criticizing how clean the house was, making intrusive comments about their finances and relationship. His physical intimidation started small, standing uncomfortably close, blocking Ethan's path, giving friendly shoulder pats that were hard enough to sting. If Kristen wasn't home, Blake would escalate quickly, slamming Ethan against walls, grabbing him by the collar, leaning in close to threaten him about what would H if he mentioned any of it to Kristen. Craig was subtler but more strategic. He preferred weekends, especially Saturday mornings when Kristen took Sophie to her parents' house. He'd use those hours to. Craig would show up with takeout, acting warm and friendly at first, easing into conversation like he genuinely cared. But it always shifted. Slowly the questions turned pointed. He'd pry into Ethan's job performance, his income, his savings, whether he was providing well enough for his wife and child. Every question was framed as concern, but every word was meant to make him feel small. Craig's the one who first threatened Sophie, Ethan said, his voice trembling. He did it like he was commenting on the weather. He mentioned how kids can get hurt so easily, how tragic it would be if something happened because I wasn't doing a good job protecting her. He even smiled while he said it. Ethan told me that smile is what made his blood run cold. Craig enjoyed watching fear dawn in his eyes. Both brothers had keys. Both behaved like the house belonged to them, and both repeatedly warned Ethan that if he ever told Kristen the truth, they'd take everything from him. They had an entire narrative ready. Ethan was unstable, prone to fits, violent, dangerous. They'd use any defensive marks he got during their attacks as proof. They would present themselves as the heroic brothers trying to shield their sister from an abusive husband. They had mapped out the entire lie. It was a psychological war they had been winning because Ethan was terrified of losing Sophie, and because Kristen's family would believe her brothers over her husband without hesitation. I installed covert cameras throughout the house, devices disguised as ordinary objects, a mantel clock, a kitchen charger, a smoke detector in the hallway. All of them streamed to encrypted cloud storage only I could AC. I bought an audio recorder that looked like a pen and tucked it into my shirt pocket whenever I was home. I documented everything. Ethan's existing bruises, his detailed recounting of previous assaults, even copies of medical records from an ER visit he'd lied through, claiming he fell down the stairs. On the 4th day, we made the switch. Ethan trimmed his hair to match mine exactly. We exchanged clothes, IDs, phones, keys, our lives. Then I drove him to a remote cabin I'd rented 3 hours north, paid for in cash and completely untraceable. I stocked it with food, toiletries, books, and everything he'd need for a long stay. Stay here, I told him in the tiny living room. Rest, recover. I'll take care of Blake and Craig. I'll record everything. And when I've got enough proof, we'll tear them apart legally. Ethan looked at me with an expression that was equal parts gratitude, guilt, and fragile hope. I don't know how to thank you, he whispered. You don't have to. You're my brother, I said. Now go take a real shower, sleep without flinching, and let yourself heal. I'll check in every few days. That afternoon, I drove back to Seattle and stepped into Ethan's life. Kristen was still at work, Sophie was at daycare. I walked through the house, absorbing every detail, the family pictures lining the hallway, Sophie's drawings covering the fridge, Kristen's glasses resting on the coffee table. I needed to know this place like I'd lived there for years. When Kristen came home with Sophie in tow, I was in the kitchen cooking spaghetti with meat sauce, one of Ethan's usual weekday meals. I'd practiced his posture, the slightly hunched shoulders and cautious movements he'd adopted after months of walking on eggshells. Hey, I said when she entered, keeping my tone flat and small. Hey, she replied without really looking at me. She set down her purse. LP had Sophie out of her jacket and said, Traffic was awful. Sophie, go wash your hands for dinner. Sophie raced toward the bathroom, and Kristen moved through the kitchen mechanically, completely oblivious to the fact that I wasn't her husband. Why would she notice? I was imitating Ethan perfectly, the subdued, shrinking version he'd become. That first night passed quietly. I did Sophie's bedtime routine, reading her a book about a velociraptor who dreams of being a ballerina, copying every voice Ethan used. She laughed at the clumsy T-Rex dance moves and hugged Mr. Stompy close when I tucked her in. The trust in her eyes hit me like a wall. I had to keep her safe. I had to maintain the illusion flawlessly. Kristen sat in the living room watching reality TV while I loaded the dishwasher and wiped down the counters, methodically wiping the counters and loading the dishwasher exactly the way Ethan told me he did it every night. Kristen barely glanced my direction, too caught up in some reality show where rich women argued over party catering. We exchanged only a few words before heading to bed. I told her I was sleeping in the guest room because I felt a cold coming on, an excuse Ethan had coached me to use, knowing Kristen's germ anxiety would make her accept the separation without hesitation. The guest room became my command center. After Kristen drifted off, I'd pull out my laptop and review the day's footage, cataloging everything with meticulous detail. I backed up the files to multiple cloud accounts, made notes in a binder, and created a spreadsheet logging each event. Dates, times, exact quotes, threats, physical behaviors, documented with the same precision I usually reserved for engineering assignments. Blake showed up Wednesday evening, right on his usual schedule. I'd just gotten home around 6 and was warming leftovers when I heard his key in the lock. He entered like he owned the place. No knock, no greeting. Just walked straight to the fridge and grabbed a soda without asking. "Hey there, champ," he said in that patronizing tone Ethan had warned me about. Blake was a big guy, 6'2", maybe 220. All show muscles from the gym, not real strength. He had that swagger bullies carry, the confidence of someone who's never faced consequences because he's always been the loudest and largest in the room. "Rough day pushing papers?" he added. I kept my gaze low, mimicking Ethan's posture. "Just long. Lots of meetings." "Meetings," he snorted, as if the word itself was pathetic. "Must be exhausting sitting around talking strategies while actual men do real work." He flexed his shoulders like he was showing off. "My guys poured the foundation for a 3-story office build today. Something that'll actually matter when it's done." The message was obvious. Ethan was useless, his career meaningless, his manhood invalidated by the fact he didn't do manual labor. It was the exact script Ethan had described. Blake's routine for grinding him down. I didn't take the bait. I just kept eating my microwave casserole. Blake circled the kitchen island, stepping too close, crowding me toward the counter. Ethan had explained this tactic. Small invasions designed to remind him who was in charge. "Kristen working late again?" Blake asked, pretending he was making conversation while delivering the line like he already knew. "She'll be home at 7. Good. Wouldn't want her catching you being such a pathetic little disappointment." He shoved my shoulder. Not enough to injure, just enough to intimidate. "You embarrass her, you know that? My sister could have married literally anyone, and instead she picked you. Wild." The recorder in my pocket caught every word perfectly. The camera in the mantel clock captured Blake's looming stank. The shove, the sneer. I let him run his script. The insults, the belittling, the petty criticisms. He tore into everything. The meals, the dishes, my work clothes, even the way I stood. 20 minutes of pure erosion, each jab meant to grind Ethan's confidence into dust and remind him how powerless he supposedly was. When Kristen's headlights hit the driveway, Blake's demeanor snapped into something bright and cheerful. Suddenly he was the supportive older brother just checking on his sister's family. He ruffled my hair, a gesture that looked playful but carried the same dominance as a dog owner patting a misbehaving pet. "Good talk, champ," he announced just as Kristen walked in. "Just making sure you're taking care of my sister. Gotta look out for family, right?" Kristen smiled, entirely unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what had really been happening. "Thanks for checking in, Blake. Dinner? Nah, got plans. See you at Mom and Dad's this weekend." He gave me a sharp look on his way out, a silent threat to keep quiet. After the door closed, I joined Kristen and Sophie at the dinner table, slipping back into Ethan's quiet, diminished role, careful and controlled, beaten down husband and father, while mentally logging every detail for the confrontation I knew was coming. Sophie babbled about daycare, finger painting, a classmate who brought cookies, a glitter disaster, and I responded with the appropriate smiles and nods, staying deep in character while the recorder in my pocket quietly captured the mundane domestic scene. After Kristen and Sophie were asleep, I reviewed the day's footage. It was flawless. Crisp video of Blake crowding me, clear audio of every insult and threat. I filed it into the growing archive, arranging everything by date and compiling a narrative no attorney, judge, or jury could ever dismiss. The next 7 weeks followed the same stead routine. Blake showed up twice a week, sometimes with Craig, sometimes alone. They'd stroll in using their keys like they owned the place, taunt me, shove me, occasionally ramp up to outright violence. I documented every second, Every degrading comment, every push, every punch. The cameras caught it all in razor-sharp detail. Craig differed from Blake. He was quieter, more calculating, but far more dangerous. He specialized in psychological warfare, thinly veiled threats about Sophie, detailed predictions about custody court outcomes, smug explanations of how easy it would be to make me look violent or unstable. His recordings were some of the worst. Calm, deliberate, premeditated cruelty. The physical assaults intensified around week 4. Blake arrived in a foul mood over something at work and decided I was his outlet. In the garage, Craig pinned my arms while Blake hammered body shots into me, even got a couple to my face. I let the blows land, concentrating on the recorder in my pocket and the ceiling camera capturing everything. Kristen saw the bruises later that night. I was in the bathroom checking the swelling when she walked in. For a moment, I thought she might actually ask what happened, might finally look instead of pretending not to see. But she just sighed and said, "You need to be more careful." That one sentence told me everything. She wasn't directly participating, but she wasn't innocent. Her denial made the abuse possible. She preferred ignorance over accountability. By week 6, I had hours of footage, dozens of recorded threats, and 7 separate documented assaults. More than enough to annihilate Blake and Craig, legally and socially. All that remained was triggering the fallout. Kristen's parents were hosting a dinner for their 40th anniversary. Everyone in the family would be there. It was perfect, a captive audience. No chance for Black or Craig to deflect or escape. Maximum impact. I explained the plan to Ethan during our nightly call. He was nervous, worried things might spiral, but I assured him this was the safest route. Public setting, witnesses, evidence ready for authorities. The night before the dinner, I prepped everything. I edited the worst footage into a single highlight reel, arranged the audio tapes in order, printed photos, compiled hospital documents. I saved the files to multiple USB drives, uploaded backups to secure cloud accounts, and assembled packets for the police, for Kristen's family, and for Ethan's divorce attorney. Yes, he already had one. I'd hired him. Saturday evening, we arrived at Frank and Patricia's home. The place was packed, probably 40 guests. Blake and Craig were already holding court, cracking jokes loud enough for the room to hear. Blake smirked when he spotted me, tossed out some remark about me finally showing my face. Craig whispered something to a cousin that made them both laugh. They were so smug, so confident, completely unaware their entire world was about to collapse. Dinner played out like any big family gathering. Too many dishes, overlapping conversations, Frank telling old stories while Patricia dabbed her eyes. I stayed perfectly in character, quiet, withdrawn, exactly the version of Ethan everyone expected. After dessert, Frank stood to give a heartfelt thank you speech. When he finished, I rose to my feet. The chatter died immediately. No one expected that. "I'd like to say a few words too," I announced, voice steady, framing it as something about family and protecting the people who matter. Kristen stiffened, shooting me a sharp warning look. Blake and Craig traded glances, probably assuming I was about to humiliate myself or derail the evening. Instead, I took a small remote from my pocket and aimed it at the TV mounted on the dining room wall. Earlier in the week, I told Frank I wanted to show a slideshow of family memories. He'd happily set up the laptop input without a second thought. For the past 7 weeks, I continued as the screen blinked on. I've been documenting something happening inside this family, something everyone here needs to witness. The first clip began playing. Blake entering Ethan's home without knocking, immediately launching into insults. The audio was razor sharp. Every cruel word, every tone shift, every mocking laugh echoed through the silent room. Patricia gasped. Frank's expression darkened to a frightening shade of red. Kristen's face drained completely. Blake started to rise from his chair, but his father snapped at him to sit down and watch. Then came the rest. 7 weeks of brutality condensed into a merciless 12-minute montage. Blake slamming me into walls. Craig gripping my arms while Blake drove his fists into me. Their threats about Sophie. Their explicit plans to ruin Ethan's life if he ever spoke. Time-stamped footage, crystal-clear faces, unambiguous violence. Several people in the room began crying. Frank looked stunned, brittle, like one harsh breath would shatter him. Blake and Craig sat frozen, cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally the creeping terror of men realizing their secrets were about to bury them. When the video ended, the silence was suffocating. I addressed the room. Blake and Craig have spent over a year torturing Ethan, physically, verbally, psychologically. They threatened his child, they invaded his home, they turned his life into a nightmare, and every single person here ignored the warning signs. Blake shot up, face contorted. This isn't, you're twisting. Context? I asked evenly. Please explain the context in which beating your sister's husband and threatening a 4-year-old is acceptable. Craig Tr. IED appealing to his parents. Desperate. Dad, this is insane. He faked this somehow. We were just what? I cut in. Just committing assault? Just issuing criminal threats? Just trespassing? All of which I've already reported. And then I unveiled part 2. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the front door. I had briefed them earlier, provided a sample of the evidence, and asked them to wait nearby until I signaled. The officers approached Blake and Craig, informing them they were being taken into custody for assault, battery, harassment, and threatening a minor. Blake erupted, swearing he'd get lawyers, claiming the footage was doctored. Craig went silent, ghost white. They were cuffed in front of everyone while their parents watched in stunned horror. Kristen sobbed into her hands. As the officers guided them out, Blake shot me a venomous glare. You're going to regret this. We'll destroy you in court. We'll take everything from you. I stared straight at him. You already tried to destroy someone for an entire year, but I'm not the victim you think I am. Confusion flashed across his face, but he was pulled outside before he could respond. When the patrol cars finally drove off, the house felt hollow, just Patricia's soft crying and the shuffle of people too shocked to speak. I turned back toward the remaining guests. I think it's best if everyone goes home. If anyone wants copies of the evidence, I can provide them. Otherwise, please leave. Most of them practically ran for the door, mumbling apologies, excuses, or stunned denials. Patricia approached me last, tears streaming. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I looked at her and saw genuine devastation. Maybe you didn't know everything, I said. But the signs were there, the bruises, the fear, the way Ethan changed. Someone could have asked. Someone could have helped. She broke down harder, and Frank gently led her outside. Soon it was only Kristen and me. She sat hunched on the couch, eyes swollen, staring at me with a mixture of anger and betrayal. How could you do this to my family? She choked. We're going to lose everything because of you. I sank into the chair opposite her, suddenly bone-tired as the adrenaline drained from my system. Kristen, I said quietly, your brothers spent a year beating your husband. They terrorized your daughter. They turned your home into a battlefield, a place where fear lived in every corner, and you let it happen. You allowed it. You chose keeping them happy over keeping your own family safe. This isn't on me. This is the outcome of choices you and your brothers made again and again. She shook her head, clinging to denial. But they were just looking out for me, making sure you treated me right. I let out a hard, humorless laugh. Protecting you from what? From a husband who adored you, who wanted nothing more than a peaceful life with you. They weren't protecting you, Kristen. They were controlling you. And they were torturing him. You let them do it because standing up to them was harder than turning a blind eye. I stood up and told her the divorce papers would be filed within a week. Ethan would be pursuing full custody of Sophie, and she should start looking for her own attorney. She blinked at me, confused, about to speak. That's when I told her the truth. I'm not your husband, I said slowly, deliberately. I'm his twin brother, Nathan. I watched the words hit her. Ethan came to me 7 weeks ago, covered in bruises, terrified, barely functioning. He begged me to switch places so he could get out and recover. So I did. I stepped into his life. I took his place. And for 7 weeks, I've endured everything he endured. Every beating, every threat, every cruel word. And I documented all of it. Her expression flickered through confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally realization. You're not him. You're his brother. That's right, I continued. Everything you thought you were doing to your husband, you did to me. And meanwhile, Ethan has been somewhere safe, healing, while I built a case solid enough to bury Blake and Craig legally. Something broke in her face then, a final crack in the wall of excuses she'd been clinging to. She covered her face and sobbed. I felt nothing. I told her I'd be staying in the house that night, but she should gather her things and go to her parents. I went upstairs to the guest room I'd been using. Her crying trailed behind me, but I closed the door and shut it out. It was done. The trap had been sprung and they'd fallen straight into it. The legal wheels would turn from here. The consequences would unfold. The rebuilding would begin. I called Ethan at the cabin. He answered instantly, tension thick in his voice. I told him everything. The dinner, the evidence, the reactions, Blake and Craig being arrested, Kristen's role finally exposed. Silence. Then I heard him break, huge shaking sobs of relief. Thank you, he finally choked out. I can never repay you. You don't need to, I said. You're my brother. I'd do it all again. I told him to stay at the cabin a few more days while things settled. Then he could move into the one-bedroom place we'd already secured across town, a clean slate, far from Kristen and her family, somewhere safe, for him and Sophie during visits. We talked until the shock wore off a little. We were both exhausted, relieved, and struggling to accept that it was truly over. When we ended the call, I sat in the quiet and let the pain of the bruises sink in, let the weight of everything settle, and I finally exhaled. The fallout stretched over the next several months. Blake and Craig were hit with a stack of felony charges: second-degree assault, criminal threats, stalking, harassment. The evidence was ironclad. Both took plea deals. Blake received 18 months in county jail and 3 years probation. Craig got 14 months and probation. Both were barred from contacting Ethan or Sophie indefinitely. 4 months later, Ethan's divorce was finalized. He was granted full physical custody. Kristen was limited to supervised visits. The judge was horrified by her complicity and made it clear Ethan was the stable, protective parent. Kristen's parents, Frank and Patricia, reached out afterward. They apologized deeply and admitted they were ashamed of their sons and of their own failure to see the truth. They asked if they could still be part of Sophie's life. Ethan agreed to supervised visits, understanding that they were still her grandparents, and appeared genuinely remorseful. As for me, I returned to my condo and my normal routines. The bruises faded, the stiffness disappeared, but the experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I now know what it means to be genuinely trapped, to feel helpless, to fear asking for help. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets us bring you more stories like this one. Thank you.